Jay's Custom Creations is sponsored by Bits and Bits. Use the code JBates to save 10% off your next router bit or CNC bit purchase at bitsbits.com. This is one of those projects where I'm just checking a bunch of boxes, and as I go through the initial rough milling process, I want to explain those boxes. So the first thing that we're checking off the list is use a bunch of material here in the shop. I've got a lot of material that's just been sitting in my lumber rack, so let's use it up. I'm using 8-quarter poplar for the base of this workbench, and then 4-quarter white oak for the top of the workbench. The second box that I want to check is my daughter's 5 years old, and of course I want to encourage creating, encourage working with your hands, and obviously encourage woodworking. So I'm making her a workbench. This workbench is going to be a little bit smaller than like a typical woodworking workbench, 32 inches high, about 20 and some change wide, and about 48 inches long. So a little bit smaller than my typical or my traditional workbench. And the third box that I want to check is I want to use the CNC machine for all of the joinery. If you've been following me for any length of time, you know that I really like what the CNC technology brings to woodworking, and I want to do an entire project where all of the joinery is done on the CNC machine. The milling process always starts with a rough crosscut at the miter saw. Any ripping that needs to be done, typically use the bandsaw. Then we're going to the jointer to joint one wide face flat, then to the planer to plane the opposite face flat and parallel. And in this case, we're not going back to the jointer for a narrow face because all I really want to do is make some glue up blanks for the legs. The legs will eventually be 3.5 inches square. Actually, it's not just the legs, it's the legs and all of the rails. All of that will be 3.5 inches square. It's a good idea to write the time of the glue up on the material. That way you know how long it's been sitting in clamps when you go to remove the clamps. But in this case, I let everything sit overnight, so this step isn't really important, but it's a good habit to get into. With all of the poplar base material in clamps, I switched over to the white oak to mill all the pieces for the top assembly. And I'm gluing this together in one glue up. In years past, or all the other workbenches that I've done, I probably would have broken this up. Actually, I have broken this up into several different glue ups. And then once those smaller panels are done out of the clamps, I can run them through the planer and then glue those planed sections together for the final glue up. And that just means a lot less, hand sanding or hand planing the top to make sure all the seams and everything lines up nice and neat. However, in this case, my workflow is kind of shifted to anything large. I just glue it together and I'll put it on the CNC machine and have it flatten it. And the CNC in my case is just a much larger planer in that regard. I let everything sit in clamps overnight and then repeated the milling process on all of the base material, but this time milling it to its final dimension in height and width, or thickness and width, which is 3.5 inches square. And you see here that not all these pieces are an exact square. There's some pieces that I just didn't have enough material to get a nice, perfect, crisp corner. And that's okay, because no matter what, there's always going to be one corner or one edge of all of the base components that's going to be on the inside of the workbench and rarely seen. So I can orient all of these pieces so that that bad edge is in the least visible location. Then it's back to the miter saw to crosscut everything to its final length. Finally, the workbench top can make its way over to the CNC machine for flattening, and I'm using some bench dogs to locate it, and then some mobile stop blocks or adjustable stop blocks to hold it in place. No top-down work holding is necessary for something this large. It's definitely not going to move around, but you see right in the middle of this slab, I have one board that shifted quite a bit during glue up, and I didn't notice it, which this is really unfortunate because I have to remove about 1/2 inch on either side, top and bottom, to get it down to that particular board that slipped. That kind of sucks. I could have cut it in half and glued another board together, but oh well. I'm still gonna have a pretty large workbench top. The final dimension here ended up being 3 inches thick, but the way I'm cutting this is first having the good side up, and I'll flatten the good side first, and then we'll flip it over and then flatten the bottom side. And the reason for this is when I do all of the mortises and when I do the profile cut, I want the bottom side facing up because I'm using an upcut bit, which will produce some tear out. So if all the tear out is on the bottom side, I'm okay with that. Slab flattening or tabletop flattening on the CNC, yeah, that's a cool thing to do. But what's really interesting to me is the joinery aspect. And before I cut any joints, I need to clearly identify all of my outside faces of all the components. These are the reference faces. These are the faces that I want to line up with one another. I want the outside of the leg to line up with the outside of the workbench top. I want the outside of the rails to line up with the outside of the legs. And all I'm doing here is putting a piece of blue painter's tape just so I can keep an eye or keep track of all of these reference faces as I put all the pieces on the CNC machine. The bit that I'm using here is pretty cool. It is a 6-inch long, 1/2-inch 2-flute spiral upcut bit. This is a huge bit, and probably, actually it is the longest bit that I've ever used in a CNC machine. And even though it is 6 inches long, the cut depth is only 3 inches long. However, we can go a little bit longer than that because with it almost bottomed out in the spindle, I can't push this up anymore. It's just close to being bottomed out. I have about 4 inches of the bit sticking out of the collet, and that will allow me to cut a depth of 3.625 inches, or 3 5/8 of an inch, for the longest tenon that I have to cut. The leg tenons, all of the leg to top tenons are 3.125 inches, or 3 1/8 of an inch, because the top thickness ended up being 3 inches thick. So I'm overshooting everything by 1/8 of an inch, that way I can flush trim it to a perfect through mortise and tenon joint. The first tool path is a scoring tool path, so this goes in by 0.1 inch all the way around the perimeter, and this is just to establish a very crisp and perfect shoulder with no tear out. This is a spiral down climb cut. Then the actual pocketing tool path that creates the shape of the tenon, which is a dog bone shape. This is just an offset profile. So I took the profile of the tenon itself and then offset it large enough to cover the rest of the material. So in one sense, it is kind of an inefficient tool path because there's a lot of wasted air cutting around the side of it. But on the other side of that coin, I guess, is the fact that this is just a prototype kind of a project. I'm not mass producing these. If I was mass producing it, I think it would take a little bit of time to really optimize this particular tool path to save this, to cut this time down quite a bit. The tenon creation for the 3 1/8 of an inch tenons, the entire tool path took exactly 6 minutes, and for the 3 1/2 or 3.625 inch long tenons, that took exactly 6.5 minutes. While cutting the tenons, there's not much I can do about dust collection. You're cutting the perimeter of an object, just let the chips fly, I guess you could say. And my daughter thought it would be a lot of fun to use the leaf blower to push all of this dust into the corner of the shop where my floor sweep is. So I figured, yeah, let her play with the leaf blower, and win-win situation for everybody. She gets to have fun blowing stuff around in the shop. She gets involved in this little creation process, although it's just having fun blowing stuff. And I get a constant clean floor to walk on and not slip around. With all of the tenons cut on both the legs and the rails, we can switch over to the mortises, starting with the bottom of the workbench top. This is upside down, like I said, because this bit will produce a tremendous amount of tear out, which it actually did, quite a bit of. So we're cutting the mortises, and the very first mortise, the bit slipped out of the collet by 1/2 inch or so, and gouged halfway through to its next destination, the next mortise, before I was able to stop it. So, that was kind of a bummer. It didn't slip at all on the poplar, and I'm guessing just because poplar is not as dense, and this oak is putting a lot more stress on the spindle, pulling it down. But also, this is a brand new bit, and I don't think I cleaned it off. So there's probably some oil residue or some wax residue on the bit itself from the manufacturing process. That just kind of irked me that I gouged out the bottom of this workbench, but that's okay. It is the bottom of a workbench. Because I had to stop the machine to reset the bit height, I went ahead and test fit one of these mortises, and this is still plenty acceptable. However, I would have preferred this to be just a smidgen tighter. Plenty acceptable, but just a smidgen tighter. And I think the reason why this was just a little bit more loose than what I wanted is because I'm making a I'm making the pass in a conventional direction, which means the bit will deflect outward. And a 1/2 inch bit generally isn't going to deflect much at all, probably not noticeable at all. However, like I said, there's 4 inches of bit hanging out of this collet. That's probably going to deflect more than a typical 1/2 inch bit that I'm used to. So I'm guessing that's where the extra play came in here. But again, still plenty acceptable for a glue bond. Now mortise number 2, 3, and 4 can be cut. And again, on mortise number 4, it slipped down just a little bit and gouged through the top on the way out. That's pretty darn annoying. So at this point, this is when I realized that maybe it has a little bit of oil or wax or something on the shank of the bit. So I took it out and cleaned it really good, which I think it actually did. Cleaned the collet nut really good and the collet itself really good, and put it back in, and no problems from here on out. So lesson learned: get all the manufacturing oil off the bits before you use them. One final thing I wanted to do to the workbench top before removing it is to establish the profile all the way around. Now I'm using bench dogs for locating, which I believe are about 7/16 of an inch tall, and I'm using a piece of 1/2 inch plywood on the other side as my bigger stop blocks. So I made this profile cut go all the way minus 1/2 of an inch on the depth. So it's going to leave a little bit that I will have to flush trim later once the workbench is finally assembled. Now I'm setting up for the mortises in the legs, and each one of the legs will have 2 different cuts on 2 different faces, again making sure the inside face is facing up. That way any tear out is going to be completely covered up with the tenon that goes in place. So I'm using bench dogs for positioning. I'm using these larger orange stop blocks for immobilizing the object, but I'm also adding one top-down clamp near the opposite side where the mortise is not, and that's just to stop this from rocking back and forth or kind of rotating as it's being cut. This is a little bit more top-heavy compared to the workbench, so I don't want these pieces to roll as the mortise is being cut. Thankfully, all of my bit slippage woes were behind me at this point. I did check every single time I completed a mortise on the legs. I measured, and it was still that same 4 inches or so of bit sticking out of the collet, so we didn't have any slippage anymore, which was great. A part of me thinks, obviously that had something to do with the oils that may have been on the bit from the manufacturing process, but also, the white oak is a much more dense material, so as it's cutting, that bit is actually it's essentially grabbing onto the material a little bit and pulling itself down. It's an upcut bit, so the white oak is in a sense pulling it down from the collet much more than this poplar is. Each leg gets a mortise on what I'm calling in the top mortise position for the side rails, and then each leg is put back onto the machine once again in a different orientation for what I'm calling the bottom mortises for the front and back lower rails. It's just a rinse and repeat process, and run through all these to get them all done. Glue ups are sometimes the most stressful part of all of woodworking, so to make this as non-stressful as possible, I put a tarp down on my floor, put some riser blocks down on top of that so I could put the workbench top upside down on those riser blocks and allow the leg tenons to go all the way through without contacting the floor, so that I could take my time using epoxy to put all of these joints together. So there's, let's see, 1, 2, 3 joints per leg. There's 4 legs, so that's 12 joints that need to be glued and closed up, and it's kind of a order of operations thing here. I got to get the entire base glued together before I set any leg down into the workbench top. Using epoxy is the best thing in my opinion for this situation because a much longer open assembly time, assuming you're using a slower setting epoxy, which I am in this case. So once I got it all assembled, I could put a couple of clamps on it in either direction to really pull the joints home nice and tight so all the shoulders are tight where they need to be. And then I was able to flip it over, no clamps connecting the base to the top. There's enough conflicting geometry here that way everything is going to hold itself together. But I did want to flip it over so that way I can pick it up and slam it back down just to make sure that the leg mortise and tenon joints were properly seated. And then that's it. There's still a little bit left to do, obviously, but this is as far as I wanted to get in this particular video. I wanted to get all of the pieces cut, the joinery cut, and it all assembled. I'll fine-tune the rest of it probably in the next video. I still need to flush trim the top profile all the way around. I need to flush trim all of the through tenons. And what else do I need to do? On the bottom side where all the tear out is, I just need to come back and sand all that tear out nice and smooth around the perimeter. I need to put a workbench vise on it. Probably going to go with a metal vise just because it's easier for my daughter to manipulate and work with. And then I'm going to paint the base. I want to do that Tuscan red base color all the way around the poplar base, and then put some oil on the top, and that white oak will really pop and complement the workbench base in this case. I think so anyway. So a little bit left to do. My daughter still has no idea that this is for her. She hasn't seen it glued up, but I think it's really cool that she's about to have a workbench of her own. So that's it for this video. You guys take care, have a great day, and I'll talk to you in the next one.